thank you. It's always weird to hear that read out loud. Cool. Let me know if I feel like it's pretty echoey in here. I think it's fine. But if I get quiet for any reason or if I start talking too fast, let me know. I can repeat things. I have been known to need to repeat things sometimes. I speak a little quickly occasionally. Great. So as I said, I'm one of the Sitka Center artists in residence from this year. I'm going to be talking about the work that's up. I think most people got a chance to see it, so that's good. And I want to speak a little bit about this body of work, which is kind of in development. It's been in development for a couple of years now. I've been sort of slowly forming it. I'll go into like the different parts of that in a second. And because of this like ongoing nature, it's like still very much, I'm still not totally sure how to talk about it. A lot of the ideas that I think I'm kind of interested in are a little bit complex. And kind of intertwined with a lot of other ideas. And so when I start to try and tease out what I'm going to say, I often end up being like getting lost in what I actually want to say. So I say that because I think that that's in some ways important to the work and in some ways gives good context for like where I am in this moment in this talk. So this is sort of like, this is what I have at the moment, this is where it's going. And hopefully like talking about it will help. It already has, like the process of just curating the work and actually thinking about the work and thinking about what I'm gonna say is a big part of that. Yeah, great. So I think for this talk I'm gonna go through a structure of about 3 different sections. Generally speaking, within this work I've been using 3 different lenses, categories, layers to sort of process and think about what I'm trying to ask. I think between those sections I'll probably have time for some questions. So this might turn into a little bit more of a conversation, which is totally fine if that happens. I want to give a quick intro to like my practice overall to give some context for that as well. So I'm a fair amount of you know me, but I'm a fairly interdisciplinary or like multidisciplinary artist. So I often have lots of different projects going on at a time, too many projects going on at a time. But part of that, like that perspective of having these like links between all these different mediums is really important to me to kind of seek out what one problem can be tackled by when you use one medium versus a different medium, or how the questions change when you're doing so, when you're switching between mediums. Also, like actually mixing mediums is a big part of it too, and like discovering like where the tensions are between those two and how that also changes the questions and all these types of things. And that interdisciplinary sort of framework and lens kind of feeds into like my life practice and like education practice as well. So I increasingly have been like viewing my art practice as research almost, particularly with projects like this. Some other projects are a little bit more just like goofy and for fun, and it doesn't really matter. But projects like this, I've been like increasingly sort of viewing them as research. And that interdisciplinary lens really helps with that because I kind of seek out to like books and ideas from 2 different perspectives, like a book on neurobiology being read or listened to at the same time as a book on ecology, and kind of like looking for the points where they kind of connect and they kind of support each other or are different from each other. And that for me personally really helps to push this type of work forward, but also adds to that like convoluted nature that I was kind of mentioning earlier, where it's like kind of confusing at the same time. So all of that is sort of like where I'm at the moment in general and with this work in theory. Yeah, cool. So the work is currently titled Imataksuti, What is My Name? Imataksuti is Quechua for what is my name, which is the language of the Incan Empire with my ancestors, some of my ancestors, the Incas. It explores indigenous, or the idea of indigenous erasure as it kind of links to modern day. And that can be like, you can use any kind of insert any fancy word there, like modern capitalism, like late stage capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, just like the current moment that we're in right now. And how indigenous erasure relates to that. That's sort of like the general idea that I'm kind of exploring with this work. And also like how that journey challenges those contemporary narratives of how we make sense of the world around us. Yeah, cool. So the 3 sort of categories that I've been approaching that work through that I kind of mentioned earlier are, I've been calling them like this individual impact sort of layer, kind of like at the ground level, what observations do I make that are tied to this larger idea of indigenous erasure. And then this like other perspective or layer of historical context or historical impacts, which is where a little bit more of like a research layer where I'm kind of like seeking out the histories or the hidden histories, the lost histories that give that like context for that initial layer and the way the two are tied together. And then the third layer is a little bit more difficult to pin down. I've kind of been taken to calling it like ecological impacts or like broader systems connections. And it's kind of like the way that these two are connected to that broader, like this like broader philosophies and these broader narratives that we use to construct the world around us or make sense of the world around us. And these three are not hierarchical. They're very like, all three of them kind of like came about at the same time and they've all kind of evolved together as time has gone on. So it's not so much like I started at one place and then moved to the next and then moved to the next. They're all still actively being researched and developed. Yeah, cool. Does anyone have any questions to start with? I'm going to go dive into the first category if not. Great, cool. Okay, so the first category I'm going to start with is the individual impacts layer. And I think it's like the sort of most accurate starting point, the closest starting point that I have, even though they all kind of have like evolved together. The work really began as kind of an interest in reconnecting with my own indigenous heritage. My family is from Cuenca, Ecuador, and I moved here when I was pretty young, or I was moved here when I was pretty young, at like 3 or 4 years old. And I think that as time has gone on, I've really started to realize like how big of an impact that's had on me. Growing up, moving from this very overexploited, brown country to these like very white, at times wealthy spaces, at least in some of the schools I went to here in Portland. And always feeling a little bit like out of place, out of touch. That's like in some ways a very human thing, you know? I think it is just odd to exist, and I think everyone kind of feels a little bit like uncomfortable with being alive at times, because it's hard to like be born and make sense of what all this is. But I think when you're part of a marginalized community, you can kind of like, it can be exacerbated a little bit, and I think I sort of felt that growing up quite a bit. And so a few years ago, I started to be curious about, I'd always known that I had indigenous heritage, but I began to be curious about how that is linked to this general feeling of being outside, you know, and being a little bit on the margins of things. And I started to really realize how many barriers there were between me and my indigenous heritage too, because not only am I like not in the physical place where that indigenous culture exists, but also there's, even if I was in that, you know, indigenous cultural place over here, there's still this like huge barrier of colonization and erasure that's like stopping me from accessing that in the first place, you know. It's not like when you go to Cuenca, Ecuador, that it's just, you're just entrenched in it everywhere. It is around, but it's still very lost, you know, in a lot of ways. So that was something that I was really curious about. So I began to sort of like, in the process of curating this work, I started to realize that a lot of the photos I had been making over the last 2 years were kind of trying to capture and observe little moments that were interested in these like on the ground level observations that were attached to a lot of this indigenous heritage in the past. So like this photo, for example, is my dad's hand holding my abuelita's hand. And I love this photo, and I think for me, like when I kind of reflect and think through the work, I realize that like this piece is very much interested in that like community aspect, that like very family-oriented value that is a little bit lost in Western culture. It's a little bit more individual, you know, in the Western paradigm quite a bit, and so that being depicted in moments like this, or moments like this as well. Ever since I was a child, my dad has always said that he's always felt a very strong connection to the natural world, and kind of like an empathy, a strong empathy for the plant life and animal life. And my interpretation has always been that he has attributed that to having indigenous heritage, which growing up, you know, it just was like, oh yeah, that's just what my dad thinks, you know what I mean? But in the process of making this work, I really started to realize that like there is this kind of like whisper of indigeneity that's like still within me, despite the fact that I've been so far removed, and kind of like these photos capture little moments like that. So like this is my dad feeding birds, for example, is like part of that like empathy to reach out to the animal world. And then this like communal, this like is a photo of me and my family when we make tamales during like Christmas time. That again is like not something I would really think of as like indigenous, but this like process of gathering together around food in particular, which kind of ties back to this like relationship to the natural world, because that food in the context of indigenous culture does tie you to that place. That's a very place-oriented thing. Food is one of the strongest ways that we connect to the land that we're on, which again is something that's very lost, which I'll kind of dive into a little bit more in the future like layers, and that's kind of like how they all relate to each other. Yeah, that's like for the photo wall, and then for the printmaking wall over here, which those are the two walls that have the work on them. There's the two kind of like mirror each other in the curation. So each one has these like 3 categories on them, and each one has like a piece or two that talks about these categories. So that was for the photo wall. For the printmaking wall, it's this poem piece which is titled Imataksuti una inquietud in broken Quechua. And it is very interested in how language and material kind of can represent or try and express this like lament that I'm sort of feeling with like the loss. I used a embossing technique, which I actually discovered while I was in Cuenca at one point. And you can't really see it in the photo here, but I recommend going to check it out if you can. It's a really cool technique that kind of just sparked a lot of this, actually. It's just like one piece that I saw in a museum, and I was like, that's so cool. I'm going to use that at some point, and it kind of led to a lot of this. And then there's a woodcut translation in Spanish, which is the Una Inquietud section, and then in broken Quechua is a linoleum print. And each of those I kind of like spent a lot of time, probably too much time, like overthinking, like what does this mean? Like how is this linked to what I'm trying to explore? Does it matter at all? This was a piece that I ended up like workshopping quite a bit with like family and my poetry cohort, which I thank you to both of them, all of them. This to me, I think too, I want to mention is like, I'll talk about this later as well. Language is such an important part of culture, and I think that any time you learn a new language, you really are kind of adapting to a new culture in some ways. And I think that for that reason, this like interest in re-accessing or relearning Quechua for me is like so important, because there is a lot, and I still don't like feel like, I wrote this in front of, I can actually show you, I wrote this looking at this while I was on a research trip, just looking at these ruins and kind of reflecting, and I had this little like booklet of Quechua phrases and like grammar and just kind of tried to cobble together a poem. But I still don't know if it's grammatically accurate or not, which is kind of part of that process of lament. You know, all of it is very much expressing from a like ideally a very genuine and authentic and raw place that I don't really know if this is if anything will come of this, you know, but I want to try at least. And so that like loss I think is so important, and that's also reflected in this piece where I'm kind of like curious, like every single one of these translations is not a word for word translation necessarily, despite the fact that they do mean the same thing. The feeling that you get when you speak all 3 languages, and I don't even speak Quechua, like is probably very different one after the other. And that's something that I'm also very interested in within a lot of this work. Yeah. Okay, that's all I have for this section. Does anyone have any? Go ahead. Oh yeah, I can read it. Yeah. Imatak suti, imatak harawi, nukamanan yachai, nukaikumanan yachai, dispin sayuwai, dispin sayuwai. ¿Cuál es mi nombre? ¿Cuál es mi canción? No lo sé. No sabemos. Lo lamento. Lo siento. What is my name? What is my song? I don't know. We don't know. I'm sorry. I am sorry. Yeah, that's the piece. Cool. Any other? Go ahead.
I noticed you used 2 different words for I'm sorry in Spanish. I thought that sorry was like a really lacking word in English. These are all different kinds of different things. And like they're totally different from each other.
Totally.
I'm just curious about your choice there to use on power.
Yeah, definitely. The Spanish category for me, the Spanish translation, or I don't even know if I would call it a translation necessarily, but that Spanish section of this overall poem, it's kind of like all 3 together are the poem, was definitely, I think, the point of playing with this linguistic exploration of like how the poem changes depending on the language, because in Quechua I don't really speak Quechua, and in English I'm a pretty fluent speaker. I've been speaking for a long time. Spanish is kind of like an interesting one where I do speak Spanish, and I am fluent, but I do like forget words sometimes. So there's a little bit of room for like exploring that play a bit. And so lo lamento versus lo siento. I feel like lo lamento to me, in how I approach that word, I think feels more like not like regret, but like I am sorry that it happened. It's like less like taking ownership over it, you know? I'm sorry in English is a little bit more like I am sorry, I'm taking accountability for what this is. But in Spanish, lo lamento is more like I'm regretful that it happened, that it came to be. You know what I mean? It's a little bit less like, it's a little bit less individual, it's a little bit less on the self, you know what I mean? Whereas lo siento is a little bit more of like, I am sorry, that is like a more direct translation, yeah. And so I just felt like that was it felt more accurate to what I meant by that section. Whereas in English, you can kind of just change it by the intonation, you know? So you can say like, I'm sorry, I am sorry. And like when I read it, that's often what I do, because that's kind of what I mean. But in Spanish, I felt like lo lamento and lo siento kind of captured that a little bit better than just like, because there's no self in either of those. Lo lamento, lo siento, you're not saying I, you're not saying yo siento, you know what I mean? There's just a little bit, yeah. Lo siento is like that, lo is not quite the self, it's more like general, yeah. So you need to kind of change the language to be able to address that, yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Any other questions before I move on? Cool, thank you. Sweet. So yeah, the next category, actually I'll leave it on this image right here. The next category is sort of like the historical context or historical impacts, historical erasure. This one's a little bit difficult to talk about because it is kind of very wrapped up in the last category, because as I start to explore the historical narratives, I very quickly run into the underpinning philosophies that are cocoon a lot of the indigenous practices that I was kind of coming across, which automatically like are kind of butt heads with like Western values, which kind of ties into that larger overarching structure. So I think for this section, I'm more just going to talk about the narratives themselves and the process of that research. This one, they all are like very ongoing, but this one I very much feel like I'm actively working on. I was listening to a book on my way here about like pre-Columbian history in that actually was talking about the Incan Empire, and I just like, he like flipped a fast one on me where he like gave the whole Western narrative of like the what happened and like why the Incan Empire fell, and I was like, damn, that's crazy. And then I like, as I was walking up, he was like, I just pulled a fast one on you like in the book, and then it was like, I just gave the like Western version of what it is. There's actually a lot of, so it's kind of funny. So anyway, that's just to give context to the fact that this is like an I'm actively working on it, and so it's very much in process. So for that reason, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the actual process of the research itself. So as I said, I went on a research trip where I kind of intentionally went to Cuenca and Ecuador to actually study a lot of these ideas, and I went to different archaeological sites. I wrote the poem while I was here. This is the museum Pumapungo, el Museo de Pumapungo in Cuenca. And then I also went to a few different exhibitions that had like different artifacts and sort of like read up and learned and whatnot. And one of the biggest things that I really took away, the little that I did, I feel like there's so much that it's kind of like overwhelming sometimes, but the little that I took away from it was that the Incan Empire, which I had always considered to be like those were my indigenous ancestors. It was the Incas, that was them. They had only been around for about 100 years before Columbus actually showed up. Which is really not that long. And before that, there was, like 10,000 years plus of indigenous existence on the continent. And the 10,000 years is actually very much in dispute, which I also discovered. It was like 10,000 years is the Clovis theory, is like the idea that the indigenous people arrived and walked down the land around 10,000 years ago. But there's a lot of dispute about that, and it actually may have been like much further. There's a lot of really solid evidence that shows that's not the case. So this kind of like really impacted and drove the point home of that erasure being like how much is lost. It's not just that like 100 years of the Incan Empire, it's like everything before that, so much of the history was also oral, as oral traditions and whatnot. And so some of the photos that I have up are just sort of like reflecting that relationship. This is like a stone tablet that was at the ruinas de Cojitambo, which is a town a little bit out ways from Cuenca. And it is it has the names of all the people who worked on, I think, on the restoration of the site, but it was cracked and on the ground, and I just felt like it had this like relationship to this like everything I was thinking about a little bit, so I documented that. This is another set of ruins that are just like in Cuenca, like on the street corner, which again had this like relationship of it being integrated but yet so far away. It was also abandoned. It used to be a museum, and then it wasn't operating anymore. I think partially because of COVID, but at the time for me it was very like poetically impactful. So then one of the other things that I think I really got out of that research trip was kind of tying it back to this individual impact layer. As I dug through these histories, I realized that some of those traditions like remain within the culture still. So this is a house that it's called Casa de las Cruces, House of Crosses, that my cousin kind of told me like an urban legend about, which I can't corroborate, so I don't know how real it is, but it was really interesting to me. And it was basically that, as the legend goes, there was some people at the top floor one day throwing rocks down at the bottom, and the police were called. So they showed up and they went up the stairs to try and stop them. And when they got up there, there was no one there. And they were like, where did they go? And then the windows started rattling, and then things started flying off the shelves. And some of it might have been a little bit embellished, I don't know. But the police, like, they got scared to themselves, and they ran downstairs, they ran away, and people started putting crosses in those windows. And I think the upper area is allegedly abandoned now. It's just that like lower portion that's used for like, I think it's a bank or a business, I don't remember exactly. We had a whole debate about this with my family recently, figuring out what it was. But yeah, I think for me, like little stories like that I kind of came across really symbolized how that like oral tradition is sort of still around despite all these years of erasure, you know? And again, it's not something that you would call indigenous, but it still has this like pattern of stories being told, you know, between family members as time goes on. So that was another piece that really like was impactful for me during the research portion. This is the big kind of piece from this category that I think captures a little bit of what that historical context gave to me. This is called 500 Years, very ongoing piece. It is made up of a series of prints that uses this symbol, which is called the chacana. And it's a symbol that's found all up and down the Incan Empire, that there's not really a consensus, at least in the research that I've seen so far, there's not really a consensus on what it means or what its purpose was or anything like that. But there's a lot of possible theories. And so I ended up kind of compiling everything that I could find into this print, and then slowly faded it out into this embossing technique that I also used for the poetry piece, and then began to kind of fade in a like Judeo-Christian cross on top of that. Because one of the biggest things that I found while I was researching was that as the story goes, the conquistadors kind of saw this chacana symbol and noticed that it was like had some similarity to the cross. So they ended up using it as a way to almost like sell Christianity to the Incan Empire, the people of the Incan Empire at the time. And that's kind of like, you know, a very still continuing process. And that was the other thing that I really got out of the research that I've done so far, which is why I kind of say that like it's very much still going on. This piece is not completed. I want to add a 7th print if I make it to the year 2092 and change the name to 600 years. So it's a little bit of a documentation that's ongoing. And I think too, that's like a really important part of this piece for me. That's like, it's not finished. And if I can get someone to do one in 3092, we'll have someone do it then, you know what I mean? And hopefully it'll look much different than it does now and not with the cross on it still. Or something will be changing in it, yeah, who knows? Yeah, great. So that's sort of that section a little bit. I'll go into the next one if anyone has any questions for that portion. Cool, sweet. So yeah, as I said, the next section is very tied into the last one. During this research process, I really came up to this point where I realized that, and I kind of knew this already, but it just like hits very differently when you're sitting with the ideas for a very long time and like researching for a very long time and like listening to books on it for a very long time. It really started to just deeply sink in how different these like indigenous cultural values were to like Western colonial perceptions of existence, period. And for example, like this really impactful one that kind of like kept coming up for me was this idea of like humans and nature versus humans in nature, which is that like, you know, the Western sort of paradigm views humans as a separate thing from nature. It's a humans are over here and nature is over there. And it's this process of like almost turning nature into static things, into objects, which can then be, you know, it's much easier then to commodify them and to sell them in lots of ways. You know, you kind of separate that link, that like community link to those beings. Whereas on the indigenous sort of side of things, and it's not a monolith as well, this is sort of just like a common theme that happens through a lot of indigenous cultures, but there's a lot of variation as well, which is something too that I've discovered. It's very much more that nature is viewed as having agency and autonomy, and that they are beings that are on the same level as us. You know, it's not this separate thing. It's humans exist as part of this larger ecosystem, which kind of ties back to that like individual layer of like the empathy that my dad has, for example, for like the plant life around, like that feeling of having them be like kin. There's a really beautiful quote in this book, Breeding Sweetgrass, which is pretty popular. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But she talks about how her experience relearning the language of Potawatomi was really difficult because the grammar in Potawatomi does not have nouns for things in the natural world. So in English, you know, you call a river, and it has a very specific definition. It has a very specific behavior. It has a very specific category that exists within all these different bodies of water. You know, but in Potawatomi, you call a river it's more of a verb, where it's like it's water that's choosing to be a river at this moment, and a bay is choosing to be a bay at that moment. Ocean is choosing to be an ocean at that moment, and it's not static. It's allowed to have that freedom to move around because it's also a being, which I find really beautiful, and also like very like that's not Quechua, but it's like this same sort of idea of like giving plant and animal life this like not even option. You're not even giving, they just have the option. They just exist like we do, you know? And those two are like so different from each other, which is just crazy to me. I like, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, it's really, it really like impacts me deeply. And I think like my time at Sitka like really helped to like drive this point home in a way that I didn't really like realize at the time, because I was in the woods, in this very specific little patch of the woods that I was allowed to explore daily, you know. And I work currently for the city of Portland, taking care of like the natural areas, but that is a different dynamic. You know, I'm like going into a place every few months to like specifically care for a set of plants that I'm like assigned. At Sitka, it was more like I was just wandering the wood. I was just there, you know. And we were really lucky, me and my cohort, to experience a big ice storm that happened like the first weekend we were there. We lost power, everything froze over. And over the next few weeks, we got to watch like the ice melt. And there were this beautiful like tree that had fallen in the woods behind that I like really fell in love with and just spent all this time with, like 10 minutes, just like sitting there with this tree taking photos on like a few different walks. And I would go deeper and deeper. We weren't supposed to, but don't tell anyone. I would go deeper and deeper into the woods every single time because I was just like more and more curious. And it was really beautiful because like I started to like notice like landmarks, and I started to be like, oh, I remember this spot, and this is how I remember how to get back, because I recognize this particular patch of 3 trees with this open field. I recognize this one snag that has this view next to it, you know? And I think without realizing it, I really started to recognize that in a context where you view the natural world as kin and as relatives, you form a much deeper connection, and it becomes much, much, much more difficult to validate like a lot of the things that we just consider totally normal today, like the lumber industry, you know, or monocrops, as opposed to like trying to integrate into the ecosystem like your agriculture. And all of that just like really weighed me down, weighed heavily. And I like, this is like one of the first pieces I ever created within this work, which kind of like also is representative of that process of how all three of these kind of move together, where like this is the third category I'm talking about, but this is the first piece I made. And so they're all very much moving alongside each other. And this was done with native plants from Ecuador and from here. This is one from Ecuador called lemon verbena, or cedron. And it kind of tried to capture that like relationship of the English language or colonial values sort of turning the natural world into static symbols, as opposed to the alternative of viewing it much more as like an integrated thing. And also has a little bit of that like individual impact layer as well, because the Quechua side, which is the positive image, not the negative image, I don't know the name for this plant, in Quechua. I just use the word for us, which is nucanchis, and then translated it into Spanish and English, nosotros and us. And it kind of was like a little bit of that lament, being like, I don't know the name of the plant, but I know that it's not just a static thing. I know that it's not just a like object that can be bought and sold as we view it in this like binomial nomenclature side, which is the Aloysia citrodora side over here. Yeah. I just feel like that's like one of the biggest benefits that I've had from developing this work, is really realizing how unstable and how almost like not invalid, but just like not firm. A lot of the narratives that we use today to like make sense of the world around us are based in things that are like not sound. And you could very easily have a totally different perspective, a totally different philosophical underpinning, and view the world totally differently, which is what this like research project has like kind of given me. And I'm really excited to keep going. I really hope that I get to keep going, because it's been really, 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 really impactful in a lot of ways. And I just feel really thankful that I've gotten to work on it at all, and to share it to some extent. Yeah. I feel like I'm leaving out a lot, but that was probably a lot right there anyway. That's what I was kind of saying, was like, it's all just like a mess in my mind, but it's a beautiful mess, which I really, really like. Yeah. I think I'll have like a moment for questions now on that section, but I just want to give a quick thank you to like everyone who's supported the work, Blue Sky Gallery and the Sitka Center, and all my cohort from Sitka, and every family and friend and member that has ever like helped with this, and RACC too, because they gave me a little bit of funding for the project, which I couldn't have done without any of that. And the Nat Turner Project. There's just so many things that have gone into this that I'm really appreciative of. Yeah. Cool. Does anyone have any final questions or thoughts or anything like that to inquire about or share?
I don't have a question, but the thought process of it all is amazing. Like, and I heard some stuff, like, when you were talking about, like, the ocean and, like, the nature just being, we don't have to give an option. It's like nature just let it. I thought that was really amazing. And then with the tree falling down in that picture, it was just like usually when I see a tree and it's down, it's brown, like it's dead, that just seemed like really cool, like fresh, everything. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that was what made me like really, really love that tree. It like very clearly had fallen like far before its time. You know what I mean? That was a live tree that had like collapsed during the storm, which I was like, yeah, I totally agree. I had a whole like series of photos of it that were just like crazy close up on that red, because it was like really beautiful. I think it's kind of its own thing. I feel like it's kind of its own project, so I'm like leaving it to the side. But I totally agree. Yeah, it was really beautiful. Definitely. Yeah.
So you touched on a little bit about being at Sitka and how that influenced your work for this project. I'd love to know if there was any sort of, seems like you're very thoughtful and you have a lot of different, I love how you took us through your three structures. Did you have any other epiphanies while you were at Sitka at the time? And I think that's kind of aha moments.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Any other there epiphanies at Sitka at the time? I feel like, I mean, the big one was really just like that connection to the land. I feel like, I think too, I was able to sort of like, oh my God, I had so many epiphanies at Sitka, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, I got a lot of epiphanies at Sitka. One of them was like not related to the work, but was very much that like I felt that this was the right track for me, if that makes any sense. Like I think being at that residency, I've always like known that I've really enjoyed like making and thinking and processing the world in this way, but I think being at Sitka like just like drove it home where it was like there's, you know, as you like go through life and you're like working in different places, you're kind of like maybe this, maybe this, maybe this, but being at Sitka was like this is the only thing that I would ever like actually be able to do that would give me like a reason to be alive. Like this is it, you know. And I feel like that was a really important epiphany to have. Also kind of a complex one because art is not very well supported, but it was kind of like this is it. Like this is the thing that I at least for the foreseeable like future, this is it for me. You know what I mean? Yeah. That and then like so many other little projects like walking through the woods. Like I have this like idea for a film that I've been like developing for a while, and walking through the wood just like made me realize like there's so much you could do in this specific place. That was an epiphany for that project too. I like spent a lot of time just like laying on the ground in the wilderness too, and I had these like thoughts of like particular scenes for like other films that I could make. I don't know, I can't even like explain it. It was just like every single corner was like some new epiphany for some new project. Yeah. But the big one was that like this is the right track for me. I really just want to keep doing this. Yeah.
I love that, in particular because we looked at all these applications and there's so many great applicants, but I think when we were looking at yours, the whole jury, I remember us just being so unanimous and felt so strongly, like how you're saying, like, oh my God, they just belong. Like, between their job and their art and your statement, and it was like, oh, we're so excited to see what they do next and what they would do with this. And it just stood out of like the way I love everybody else's in that sense. I just felt like, it felt like this was made for you.
Wow. No, I mean, I felt the same way. It was like the perfect moment for me. I was like, this is incredible. That's really nice to hear. Thank you.
We love to get the opportunity, obviously, to do this, but it was one of those things where and even seeing your work now and hearing you talk, it's like, this is why we do this.
Yeah.
And so it's really great. So thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Did you have a question as well?
Well, comment first, I resonated with what you mentioned about getting to know the trees around Sitka, and how when you get to know a little part of nature, it becomes like part of you and part of every community.
Totally.
In a way that I think like extractive industry and capitalism make it not. Or like we just think of not being that way, and think about like people when they like kids know like a pet, for example, they have like such a foundation, they do so much for that one animal. Like what if we felt that about all nature?
Yeah.
This is our community, this is our family.
Yeah, totally.
And
Yeah.
Very inspiring. I share that feeling in Sitka.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you, like, you've got so many brilliant ideas. Like, how do you balance like learning, thinking with like trees, and like knowing when to like start making the art?
Yeah.
What's your process around that? 'Cause that seems like so tough.
Yeah. That's a great question. I feel like, that's a good question. I feel like that's something that I'm still figuring out. I probably do have some type of method, but I haven't like pinpointed what it is. I haven't like followed the pattern yet enough to like know or like be able to like say it off the jack, you know, or like right off immediately. I feel like for me, the like research portion of it is very like just integrated into my regular life. So I have like a little schedule where like Monday and Tuesday are like language day, or supposed to be. Not every single week goes perfectly, but like Monday and Tuesday are supposed to be like language day, and like Wednesday is supposed to be like music day, and like Thursday is like ecology day, and like Friday is philosophy day. So I kind of like go through the whole week just like spending my time, spending like at least an hour or more just like reading or listening to something. And then in that way, like the art part of it doesn't necessarily have to wait for it to be completed. It sort of just like comes out because I've been researching just like naturally. Even when I'm not, like if I don't have a project going on, I have like, let's pick a new book to like look into, you know what I mean? Yeah, that was one of the beautiful things too that happened at Sitka, was that like connecting with the cohort really gave me like new things to look into. Like I ended up reading the like Entangled Life book or whatever that actually you mentioned, which was like incredibly beautiful. I read it at the same time as like this book on determinism, and the two just like really complemented each other like beautifully. And that wasn't like necessarily intentionally linked to the work that I was making, but it ended up affecting it as I was making it, you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't really know if I have like a specific like method necessarily or a process necessarily. I kind of think that it's just, I try to integrate it into my life to a point where I don't really need to worry about completing something like research before I start making, because I've already been doing it for a while. If that kind of helps to like answer the question a little bit at least. Yeah, 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 yeah. Cool. Sweet. Sounds good. Thank you so much.